Welcome back to Hill's Hangout. I'm Stanley Nunn, your host. And I'm here today with AJ Wallas. He is an employee here in the makerspace at the Hawk. But the reason why we've invited him here today is to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is role-playing games. So welcome to the show, AJ. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Yes, my name is AJ. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Okay. Well, we're glad to have you. The reason why I wanted to talk to you, because when we first met and we started talking about this, it sparked my interest that you had this wealth of knowledge about a game that I love, especially Dungeons and Dragons. So I wanted to get your take on how that affects your life and the impact it has on people. So let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved with role-playing games?
So I got involved a few years back. A friend introduced me to a YouTube channel called Critical Role, where a bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors get together and play Dungeons and Dragons. So voices from some of your favorite animes and video games got together and just let their imaginations run wild. You have your dungeon master, your DM, that kind of sets the story. They act as a narrator. And then your players go through and act out however they want to, really, and get to learn from the different scenarios that the narrator or dungeon master throws at them throughout the day.
I've been playing for a long time too, so I get it, I understand, and I know what kind of impact it's had on me. But what kind of impact is this sort of game? Because you hear a lot of stories about it, but what kind of impact has this sort of game had on your life?
For me personally, I think it helped get me out of my shell a little bit more. There's many different ways that you can play. There's combat oriented, there's role play oriented, or puzzle oriented. It really depends on your players. I've gotten to take part in a lot of the more role playing side ones, where you essentially are role-playing a scenario where you're talking to a shopkeeper or to a person that's approached you at a bar or something like that. And it puts you in these different circumstances or situations that you might not have come across in your real life, but you get to act out what you would do in those situations and see kind of what another person's reaction to that would be. So you get to kind of test real-world scenarios in a fake kind of way.
It seems like you get really into the mindset of these different characters and of your players especially when you're GMing. So talk about how the psychology of role playing affects the players and the game.
So it really gets down to you are both playing as yourself as your player character in these games, but you're also playing a better version of what you think you could be, kind of thing. So you put yourself out there. I've heard stories of people with disabilities playing as characters that have the biggest brawn in their pack, playing a barbarian or something like that. And they get this feeling of, oh, I'm actually stronger than I am, at least mentally. I might not be able to physically do these things, but getting the experience of saying that you're doing it or pretending and imagining the different scenarios and everything that you're playing through, it's kind of like creating your own better persona, something that you can strive to be. And if it doesn't work out, there's no real world repercussions. You can try a different approach. It really helps. It helps people get out of their shell a lot more. I know I've said like socially and everything like that, it brings out a lot of people, but it definitely makes it easier when you have the feedback of family and friends around you that are ebbing you on and getting you to break through some of those barriers that maybe you have going outside, doing and interacting with people. Just because you haven't experienced it a ton, you can do that in a safe setting that'll make you more comfortable to go out and do those types of things.
Okay, so it sounds like this is pretty involved, and you can learn a lot from playing these games, which I've experienced personally. I know that for sure. But what kind of skills can you help these games help develop?
I mean, honestly, I could tell you that they can help you develop skills for any academic scenario. So you've got your creative thinking, reading and writing. There's so much written material to go through on all these things that not having a decent understanding of, reading ability can make things a little bit difficult. But you can definitely push yourself past it. There's so much, it's such a gradual learning curve. It teaches things like math. It teaches things like keeping a schedule. Outside of, inside the game, you can have timelines where you actually have a given set number of days before you have to finish something. Or it could come down to, scheduling the next big game that you're playing with your friends. Keeping a schedule, social ability is a huge part of it. You have to be able to talk to people. If you can't talk to people, you're not gonna really enjoy what there is to offer from that kind of thing. The limitation is only your imagination for what you can implement into these games as a learning tool.
Gotcha. And you mentioned the social aspect, and what I've come to understand, at least in my experience playing these games, is that you have to do a lot of interacting with people and learning how to deal with different personality types in the game, both in the game and dealing with the other players in real life. So, what are some of the social skills you've gained from playing these games?
Thinking before speaking is one of the big ones, because in these kinds of things, there are, consequences to the things you say and do. You never really know how somebody's going to take your decision or your action, or what you're imagining your character is going to do versus what they're imagining your character is going to do. So it's kind of like going out and meeting people in the real world. You kind of have to slowly get to know the character or player from a DM standpoint, for a dungeon master standpoint, or game master standpoint. Getting to know what kind of things your players are into or not into. Getting those hard limits is always a really important thing before starting a game session, because you don't want to make people uncomfortable. Because that's the entire thing about this, is you're trying to help people find their comfort zones, as well as break through and expand to what they feel comfortable saying or doing.
Okay, so you've been playing a while, and you've probably played a variety of different games. What is your favorite genre of game?
I have to say the high fantasy, so your standard Dungeons and Dragons, your elves, your lizardkin, your dragons, and all that stuff is probably my bread and butter. I have watched and followed along to a couple of horror genres, so you can think of things like Cthulhu or H.P. Lovecraftian style stuff. Home builds are really, really fun. My friend actually wrote an entire campaign with new mechanics so that people could essentially roleplay in the Pokemon universe. Nice. So they would go out and they would capture Pokemon, and then there was a evil corporation that was capturing them and making them into shadow versions of themselves. So you had to try and battle your way through different Pokemon dungeons and make your way to the top to discover the big secret at the end and everything like that. But I'd say my favorite has to be just the straight up Dungeons and Dragons. 5th edition for me right now. I've tried doing Pathfinder in the past, but there's a lot of rules with Pathfinder. If you have a question, there's 5 rules that go along with it, and they all contradict each other.
Well, and that's I'm 2nd edition myself. I've played that for the last 30 years, so that's my favorite as well. 5 years from now, when virtual reality becomes the norm, what is role playing going to look like?
Honestly, I think it's going to be. We're gonna get to a point where it might be difficult to distinguish. Where a person could potentially spend way too much time in a virtual world as opposed to, spending time in reality. That's part of the benefit of having the imaginative or the tabletop versions of these games, is that you get together around with friends and everything like that in reality, and once you're done with your game, talk about real life stuff and everything like that. With virtual reality, currently and maybe 5 years from now, the interactive part of it just isn't there. So being able to get into it and actually feel what it feels like to be in these role-playing games, that's what I'm hoping we can get to with the virtual reality in 5 years. I want to be able to gather with my friends and go and fight these bosses and do all of that stuff. But in order to get to there, we've got to find a way for virtual reality to tell us the unimaginable, infinite story that is the imaginations of Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely, that would be difficult. So, okay, you've been doing this a while, so what's the best thing you've gotten out of role-playing?
The best thing I've gotten out of role-playing. I got a wife out of role-playing. So, back in 2018, I met my current wife, and she gave me the prerequisites for how I was to propose to her. It had to be filmed. It had to include all of her friends. That's everything that I was told. So I went forward and planned for the next 6 months a campaign to essentially get all of her friends to have their own individual rooms and individual puzzles. We had multiple cameras set up in my living room, filming everything. We had one of our friends join us all the way from New York via Skype to play this game with us. We all gathered around. I had, individual jokes and inside jokes that were for just us and our group. And then at the end of all of it, we came to the final room, which was this large, ornately black onyx room with a pillar in the middle and a crystalline box. And as the players entered the room, everybody but my now wife got locked in essentially a freezing spell. And so she walked up to the dais and opened the box and heard the narrator's voice, a strangely familiar yet unknown voice, ask her in her player character's native language if she would marry me. To which she responded yes, and credits roll, everybody's clapping and applauding.
If you could speak to, the world at this point and just kind of let them know what interest they could find in role-playing, what would be enticing to them about role-playing, what would you tell them?
The imagination aspect. There is quite literally no limitations for what you can do in a role-playing game. That's the entire point of it, is you are playing a role to your group of friends. So be it, fighting dragons or being a group of superheroes fighting a supervillain. There is an endless opportunity for people to find whatever niche type of game that they want, as well as expand out to things that are not quite in their repertoire of stuff that they've tried before. It's very easy to get into and try these types of games because there's almost always somebody, either one of your friends in your friends group or somebody on the internet that you can reach out to and say, hey, I'd like to give this a shot. Because they've made it so available to everybody that you don't necessarily have to be in the same room anymore. You can do all of it via webcam and internet connection. So there's nothing stopping you from making a new group of friends, like right now, and just sitting down for a couple of hours and chatting about imaginary problems.
Well, AJ, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate your insight into this and helping to explain to our audience what this is and how it can benefit them.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure getting to talk about one of my pride and joys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to thank you for joining us on Hill's Hangout. We'll see you next month.